Hi everyone. I just wanted to let everyone know that this video is copyrighted. It cannot be recorded or sold. Thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Taylor Coates and I'm going to talk to you about Arab American discrimination and disparities. So what are some major events that led to the increase in Arab American discrimination within the United States? Well, one major event that could be said to have started it all was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the State of Israel was created, sparking the First Israeli-Palestinian War. The war ended in 1949 with Israel's victory, but well over 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, and their territory was divided into three parts: Israel, the West Banks, and the Gaza Strip. The next major event that could be said to have attributed to increase in Arab American discrimination is the War of Attrition, or the Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War. This is when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise two-front attack on Israel to regain their lost territory. The conflict did not result in significant gains for Egypt, Israel, or Syria, but the Egyptian president at the time declared a war of victory for Egypt, as it allowed Egypt and Syria to negotiate over previously ceded territory. Due to the American government resupplying weapons to Israel, 18,000 Arabs died, with 721 Israeli deaths. Because of this conflict, the U.S. and Israel saw Arabs as a threat. Lastly, and probably one of the biggest factors, is 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror. The 9/11 attacks on the U.S. led to many Arab Americans across the country having to face harassment and discrimination, both in their communities and at the hands of state agencies. They often have faced arbitrary detention, racial profiling, and aggressive checks and detentions for questioning in U.S. airports and border crossings, and discrimination in many other subsequent areas as well. So let's talk about the immigration wave that occurred with Arab Americans from these historical events. Those from Arab-speaking countries began to arrive in the U.S. in three distinct waves. One wave was after the Second World War and the creation of Israel, like we talked about. Another wave was after 1965, when prejudicial immigration laws were reformed. However, during the 1980s, the U.S. cut back on the number of Middle Eastern migrants that were allowed into the country. The Iranian Revolution and the subsequent 1978 to 1980 hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy increased open hostility and widespread harassment, violence, and discrimination against Arab Americans as well. They have been targeted by FBI investigations and random violence since the early 1970s, and each U.S. confrontation or war with a Middle Eastern country is followed by an outbreak of hatred against Arab Americans and Arab-speaking people and Middle Easterners. The Gulf War of 1991 led to hundreds of anti-Arab actions, including arsons, bombings, assaults, and murders. So let's talk about discrimination occurring in Israel towards Arab Israelis at the moment, since this has been in the news lately. According to the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, Israeli-Palestinian Arabs are targeted with 65 different government laws and regulations, which ensure Palestinian Arabs do not prosper as a community, remain politically disempowered, social and economically disadvantaged, and constantly threatened with the loss of their residency and even citizenship. A law that passed in 2003 prohibited Palestinians in the West Banks to marry Israeli citizens and permanently move to Israel to obtain work. So what are some laws that can be used to combat discrimination in the United States? First, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination against anyone exercising his or her constitutional right, privileges, and immunities, and persons engaging in discriminations can be prosecuted under the Act. This means if a person is discriminating against someone based on their religion, skin color, or sexuality, they can be prosecuted with this Act. The First, Fifth, and 14th Amendment are also laws that can be used to combat discrimination in the United States. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right of freedom of expression. The Fifth Amendment guarantees that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This means that any action such as arrest, imprisonment, or deportation must be in accordance with United States law. The 14th Amendment also guarantees this right and gives everyone the right to equal treatment and protection under the law. Lastly, there is the Religious Freedom Act, which was put into place in 1993. This act prohibits any agency, department, or official of the United States or any state government from substantially burdening a person's exercise to religious freedom. Next, let's talk about disparities in the education system with Arab Americans. Discriminatory comments by other Americans in the United States usually stem from the assumption that Arab Americans are either illegally in the country or do not deserve to be living in America. There are 3 levels of discrimination that may be experienced by youth in the educational system. There is the individual discrimination, which is when a person treats another differently because of their individual's membership in a social group, or in this case, in a religion or race or ethnic group. Examples of individual discrimination would be racial slurs, avoiding interacting with that group, and bullying of that group. The next level is institutional/organizational discrimination. This occurs through policies and practices of institutions that have unequal impact on specific individuals depending on their social group membership. This includes policies prohibiting Muslim dress and head coverings while in some schools, or prohibiting Muslim holidays to be displayed on school calendars. Lastly, there is cultural discrimination, which occurs when one group has the power to define permanent cultural values of members of all social groups. This occurs more in the media, where we have an absence of positive images of Arab Americans and have more negative images instead. So, what are some disparities in health for Arab Americans? Well, there is a general surge of bias-motivated violence and hate crimes in the past few years. Arab Americans have reported high levels of depression and anxiety symptoms. Refugees of Arab-speaking countries appear to have poor mental health outcomes and health outcomes in general than other immigrants in the U.S. or U.S.-born Arab Americans. Research has also found that Arab Americans have higher rates of smoking in all age groups and low rates of smoking cessation. Recent studies have also shown an increased prevalence of multi-substance abuse among Arab Americans, particularly males, which has been associated with higher levels of adopting U.S. culture. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to escalate, the Arab American community has experienced racial disparities, the likes of which they have never experienced before. Arab Americans are the most frequently forgotten ethnic minority when it comes to healthcare across the U.S. and more so during this pandemic. Some widespread women's health issues that have been found are a high prevalence in intimate partner violence in Arab American communities. Arab American women also tend to have lower rates of mammographies and are diagnosed at later stage of breast cancer. Barriers to breast cancer screenings for Arab American women include immigration-related barriers, fear, lack of knowledge, and access issues. So, what are some homeland insecurities that Arab Americans face? After 9/11, Arab Americans were often recast as people who were not really part of the United States. They became a them, and they were not treated as eligible for the nation's civil rights and constitutional rights, even though they were legally American citizens. Many often experienced visits by law enforcement and because of a neighbor or coworker reporting them acting in a suspicious manner, whether because they made an overseas phone call, because they opened their trunk frequently, because of the way they were dressed, or because they were speaking Arabic. Arab Americans often reported being removed from airplanes or denied boarding. Some lost their jobs, and some simply reported that life in the United States was no longer the same before 9/11. Arab Americans experienced mass arrests, prevented detentions, FBI interviews, registration and fingerprinting of thousands of male foreign nationals, widespread wiretappings, secret hearings, closures of charities, criminal indictments, and a review of private internet and telecommunications and financial records, which were secured through more than 30,000 national security letters issued annually to American businesses after the passage of the U.S. Patriot Act. What about discrimination in employment that Arab Americans face in the U.S.? Over 700 incidents of hate crimes and 800 incidents of workplace discrimination were reported against Arab Americans in the 9 weeks after 9/11. There is still incidents of workplace discrimination against Arab Americans continuing to this day as well. An Arab American male applicant needs to send 2 resumes for every 1 resume sent by an American male of European descent in order to receive a call back for an interview by a hiring personnel. After 9/11, Arab and Muslim real wages and weekly earnings decreased by 9 to 11% below what they would have been had the terrorist attack never occurred. Let's talk about the politics occurring against Arab Americans and some of the great news that has also been occurring for Arab Americans as well. So, when President Donald Trump was elected, the Trump administration actively sought to merge Muslim with the threat of terrorism. One of the first steps following his inauguration was signing an executive order banning all people with not immigrant or immigrant visas from 7 Muslim majority countries, including Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen for 90 days. Trump stoked the further negative sentiment against Arab and Middle Eastern Americans at the end of 2018. Arab Americans have remained relatively unrepresented in U.S. politics, particularly at a national level. Arab Americans are misrepresented in media. For example, King Abdullah II delivered much needed protective personal equipment and medical supplies to Michigan when it was most desperately needed during the COVID-19 pandemics. On a positive note, 2018 represented a significant year for Arab and Middle Eastern community political participation. Rashida Tlaib became the first ever Palestinian American to be elected to Congress representing the district in Michigan. Arab Americans are actively participating in American politics in an unprecedented number, both as voters and candidates, according to experts in the United States. Some Arab Americans believe that elected representatives from the community are key to having their voices heard at the local, state, and federal level. An increase in Arab American voters may in turn have an impact on foreign policy decisions as well. This would be a huge factor in dreamers as well. So what can you do to be the solution to preventing Arab American discrimination? First, exercise your right to vote for politicians that follow your ideals. Engage in conversations about Middle Eastern culture and religion. Remember that Arab Americans are a mix of cultures and differences, and that each culture and person is unique and wonderful to learn about. Raise awareness of Arab American and Middle Eastern discrimination. Peacefully protest against injustices that you feel is being done to you or your community. Contact your government official if you feel that discrimination is taking place in your community. Report any discriminatory actions occurring in your workplace or educational system. Remember your civil rights, the 14th Amendment to Civil Rights Act, and more. Work together to help others in your community. Develop think tanks. Temper your anger with knowledge and positive actions. Help the youth in your communities to be proud of their culture and religion, and work towards reducing discrimination by supporting political candidates who represent your community's views and need to run for political office yourself. Ow! Help others by uplifting them and not criticizing them. Join support groups with other adults who feel discriminated against and offer ideas to help each other. Offer support groups to your children so they can feel accepted and supported by another. Get involved in multicultural organizations to work for the benefit of everyone.